The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Maggie Okafor almost didn't answer it. She was elbow-deep in her third helping of leftover jerk chicken, still wearing her coveralls with the Frostex HVAC patch on the sleeve, and the number on her phone screen was one she didn't recognize, a 2-ton-12 area code, Manhattan, which meant nothing good ever came from it. But something made her thumb swipe right. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the particular quality of the silence in her Queens apartment, the kind that pressed against the walls when it was late, and she'd eaten too much and had nowhere to be. "Is this Margaret Okafor?" The voice on the other end was clipped, precise, the kind of voice that had gone to prep school and never forgotten it. "Maggie," she said. "Nobody calls me Margaret except my mother, and she calls to complain." A pause. Then, "Mrs. Okafor. My name is Jonah Price. I'm Chief of Staff to Vincent Harlow. Mr. Harlow requires your services tonight." Maggie set down her fork. Vincent Harlow. She knew the name the way everyone in New York knew it. Not because they'd met him, but because his buildings were everywhere. His face was on magazine covers every other month. And 18 months ago, his company, Harlow Capital, had quietly absorbed 4 failing mid-size banks and somehow turned them into a financial entity worth $11 billion. He was 44, never married, famous for 2 things: never losing a deal and never explaining himself. "I do commercial HVAC," Maggie said. "Chillers, air handlers, rooftop units. Whatever Mr. Harlow's personal comfort situation is, I think he's looking for someone else." "The cooling system in our server room has failed," Price said. "Completely. We have approximately 90 minutes before the temperature in that room reaches a threshold that will trigger an automatic shutdown of our primary trading infrastructure. If that happens during tonight's negotiation window." He stopped himself. "We need the system restored. None of them can get there in time. You were recommended by a former client?" "Who?" "Terry Nakashima, at the Port Authority." Maggie exhaled through her nose. Terry, of course. She'd fixed a cooling failure at the Port Authority 2 winters ago, in February in the middle of a nor'easter, and she'd done it in 4 hours when every other contractor had told them 3 days minimum. Terry had apparently never forgotten. "What am I looking at? Make and model." Price rattled off the specs. Maggie was already pulling up the unit in her mental catalogue. A Liebherr DS Series Industrial Precision Cooling, 2019 install. Probably hadn't been serviced in 14 months, based on the kind of negligence that was typical in buildings that spent their money on Italian marble lobbies instead of maintenance contracts. $200 an hour, she said. "Emergency rate, plus parts at cost, plus 30%. Done. And I need access to the mechanical room and the roof. You'll have it. I'm serious about the roof. Last time someone said I'd have access, and then I spent 40 minutes arguing with a building manager in the dark M's Okafor." Price's voice was tight. "I will personally escort you to the roof if necessary." She was in her van by midnight. The Harlow Capital building was on Park Avenue, 43 floors of glass and steel that reflected the city back at itself, like it owned the reflection too. Maggie pulled her van into the service entrance on 52nd Street and climbed out, hauling her diagnostic kit over one shoulder. She was wearing fresh coveralls. She kept a spare in the van. And her natural hair was pinned up under a navy cap. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and built, as her aunt liked to say, like a woman who had never once been afraid of a second portion, which was accurate. Maggie had made peace with her body somewhere around age 26 and hadn't revisited the argument since. Jonah Price met her at the service entrance. He was exactly what his voice had promised. Mid-30s, aggressively well-groomed, a suit at midnight that still looked like it had been pressed an hour ago. He looked at her for 1/2 second too long before extending his hand. She'd seen that look before. The quick recalibration, the adjustment of expectations. She let him shake her hand and said nothing about it. "The server room is on the 31st floor, he said, already moving. "Walk me through what happened." The primary cooling unit lost pressure at approximately 10:40. The backup failed to engage. Our facilities team attempted a manual restart and made it worse. Maggie kept her face neutral. How much worse? They may have bypassed a safety interlock. She closed her eyes for one beat. Okay, she said. Let's go. The elevator was fast and silent and paneled in something that was probably reclaimed wood from a forest that had consented to be reclaimed. When the doors opened on 31, the difference in temperature was immediate. The hallway was notably warmer than the floors below, and through the glass partition ahead, Maggie could see the rows of black server towers standing in what should have been chilled air. A digital readout on the wall showed 79 Fahrenheit. Normal operating range was between 65 and 70. She had maybe an hour before it hit critical. There were people in the hallway. 4 of them clustered near the mechanical room door, 2 in suits, 1 in what looked like a facilities jumpsuit and 1 in a shirt with rolled sleeves, who was clearly trying to look calm and failing at it. They all looked at Maggie when the elevator opened. The one in the rolled-up shirt stepped forward. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that belonged on a watch advertisement and a set of shoulders that belonged on a different kind of advertisement entirely. His eyes were dark brown and currently doing something complicated, cycling through authority, anxiety, and something that might have been irritation at himself for the anxiety. "You're the contractor," he said. "I'm the contractor," Maggie agreed. Vincent Harlow. He didn't offer his hand, just said it like a statement of fact, which it was. "We have 90 minutes, I know. Probably less now. Let me see the unit." She walked past him toward the mechanical room, and to his credit he got out of her way. The mechanical room was not good. She could see immediately what the facilities team had done. They'd tried to force a manual restart on the compressor without first equalizing the pressure. And they'd popped a relief valve in the process. Refrigerant had vented. The system was effectively dead until she rebuilt the pressure circuit and replaced the valve assembly, and even that was only possible if the compressor itself hadn't seized. She crouched down next to the unit and started pulling panels. "Can you fix it?" Harlow asked from the doorway. "I don't know yet. Give me 10 minutes without questions." A silence, then his footsteps retreated. She worked fast. The valve assemblet in her kit, a compatible model she carried as a precaution, because this exact failure mode was more common than people knew. The compressor, when she checked it, had not seized. Stiff but not dead. She bled the line, checked the pressure differential, replaced the valve, and began the slow process of reintroducing refrigerant into the system from the canister in her kit. 12 minutes in, Harlow appeared in the doorway again. "The temperature is at 81, he said. "I know. The delegation from Meridian Group arrives in 40 minutes. If this system isn't operational before they see this, Mr. Harlow." Maggie didn't look up from the gauge she was reading. "I understand there's something important happening tonight. I also understand that the more you talk to me, the slower I work, because I have to process what you're saying and then set it aside and then get back to what I was doing, and that takes time. So I'm asking you, politely, to let me work." Silence. She heard Price somewhere behind Harlow say something in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words. Then Harlow said, "Fine," and she heard him leave. The Meridian Group delegation arrived at 12:51 a.m. Maggie knew because she heard them. 4 of them, 2 speaking in Mandarin, 1 in accented English that she couldn't place immediately, and 1 who wasn't speaking at all. She was still in the mechanical room 30 feet away, running the diagnostic cycle that would confirm whether the repair had held. The compressor had come back online at 12:38. The temperature in the server room was dropping 77 Fahrenheit when she'd last checked, moving in the right direction. She had maybe 15 minutes before she could confirm it was stable enough for sustained operations. Through the glass partition, she could see the Meridian Group set up on one side of the long conference table that occupied the adjacent room. Apparently, the meeting was happening here, close to the systems they were acquiring, which she supposed made a certain kind of sense. The lead negotiator from Meridian was a woman in her 50s, elegant with silver-streaked hair, and she was looking at a document that one of her associates had spread across the table. Harlow's team was on the other side. Harlow himself stood at the head of the table, and next to him was a young man with a laptop and a look of total panic. The translator, Maggie understood, was supposed to be there. She figured this out because one of the Meridian associates said something in Mandarin and then looked at the young man with the laptop, who turned to Harlow and said in a low, miserable voice, Miss Tseng says the clause on page 14 requires clarification, and I don't." He stopped. "I took 2 semesters of Mandarin in college. I can order soup dumplings. I cannot negotiate a financial acquisition." "Where is Chen?" Harlow said quietly. His voice was controlled, but Maggie could hear the edge under it. "He's his flight. The weather in Chicago. He's stuck. The airport is. Get him on a video call. The connection keeps dropping. I've tried." Tseng said something else. Her associate began responding, and then the other associate joined in, and the tone was shifting into something that Maggie recognized even without understanding the words. The particular cadence of people who are losing confidence in the other side of the table. Harlow said something to Price in a low voice. Price left the room, pulling out his phone. Maggie checked her temperature gauge. 74 Fahrenheit. Still dropping. She checked the pressure differential. Holding. She stood up, stretched her back. It always ached after she'd been crouched over a unit and walked out of the mechanical room. She didn't mean to stop. She was heading for the elevator, planning to grab the second refrigerant canister from her van as a precaution, and she had to pass the conference room to get there. But as she passed the glass wall, she heard something that stopped her foot mid-step. Miss Tseng said very clearly and precisely in Mandarin, "If they cannot provide a competent translator, I don't see how they can be trusted to execute a merger of this complexity." Maggie stood still. Her mother was from Shenyang. Her father was Nigerian-American, 3rd generation, from a family that had managed to produce, across 2 generations, a radiologist, an immigration lawyer, and an uncle who played professional chess and claimed this was equivalent. Maggie had grown up in Queens with Mandarin at home on her mother's side, Igbo at her grandmother's Sunday dinners, French from the Haitian family next door that had essentially adopted her between ages 9 and 14, and English everywhere else. She had added Portuguese in college because of a professor she'd admired, and Arabic in her late 20s, because she'd fixed the HVAC systems in 3 Yemeni-owned buildings in a row, and their facility managers had been easier to work with when she could talk to them directly. She didn't think of it as remarkable. It was just the way her life has assembled itself. She turned and walked into the conference room. Everyone looked at her. Harlow looked at her. His expression was difficult to read. There was something in it that was not quite surprise and not quite suspicion, just a particular quality of attention that she had not seen from him before. "Mrs. Tseng," Maggie said in Mandarin, "I apologize for the interruption. I want to assure you that the technical issue with the server systems has been resolved, and the temperature is now stabilizing within operational range. I also want to address your concern about the translator." Tseng's eyebrows went up approximately 1 millimeter, which Maggie suspected was the maximum they had ever gone up in her adult life. "I'm familiar with the clause on page 14, Maggie continued. "If you'll permit me, I can facilitate this conversation." She paused. "I should be transparent. I'm the HVAC contractor. I'm not a professional interpreter, but if it's useful, I'm here." A silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which, in that room, felt geological. Miss Tseng looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the woman beside her, an associate who was younger, sharper-looking, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. The associate said something in Mandarin that was too quick for Maggie to catch in full. "This is unusual, but unusual is better than nothing." Miss Tseng turned back to Maggie. "Your Mandarin is good," she said in Mandarin. "My mother is from Shenyang," Maggie said. Something in Miss Tseng's face shifted barely perceptibly. Shenyang was a specific place. It was not Beijing, not Shanghai. It was the kind of city that people from there noticed when someone mentioned it correctly. "Sit down," Miss Tseng said. Maggie pulled out a chair. She found out about the Portuguese 45 minutes later, when the fourth member of the Meridian delegation, the quiet one, the one who hadn't spoken, passed a note to Miss Tseng and then said something very softly in what was not Mandarin. Maggie said, in Portuguese, "Mr. Farias, if you have a concern, I'd be glad to help translate that as well." The man, Eduardo Farias, she would learn later, a Brazilian investor who held a 7% stake in Meridian Group and had significant reservations about the acquisition structure, stared at her. "You speak Portuguese," he said in Portuguese. "Brazilian and European," she said. "Your accent is Sao Paulo, so I'll try to stay in that register." He stared at her for another moment, then slowly began to laugh. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, but it was genuine, and it changed the temperature of the room in a way that had nothing to do with the HVAC system. Harlow, across the table, was watching her. She didn't look at him. She had work to do. The acquisition clause in question, the one on page 14, and the three that branched from it, concerned data sovereignty. Meridian Group had concerns about where the data from their subsidiary operations would be housed post-merger, and they had drafted language that Harlow's team had not fully understood because Chen, the professional interpreter, was the one who had flagged the nuance in a preliminary call, and nobody had adequately noted the flag. Maggie understood this within the first 10 minutes of the conversation. "The issue," she told Harlow, during a 5-minute recess she'd called on the grounds that both sides needed water, "is that they're not just asking about server location. They're asking about compliance jurisdiction. Who has access rights in the event of a regulatory inquiry?" Harlow looked at her. "You got that from the conversation?" "I got that from the conversation, and from the fact that Mr. Farias kept referring to a 2021 ruling, which, you probably know what ruling he means." Harlow glanced at the lawyer at his elbow, who looked the Meridian Brazil data case, the lawyer said quietly. "Right," Maggie said. "So they've been through this before, and they're not going to sign anything that doesn't explicitly address access rights in a US regulatory context. If you want to close this tonight, that clause needs to be rewritten, and they need to see the rewrite before they leave." A pause. "You understand M&A data compliance," Harlow said. It was not quite a question. "I understand that every building I've ever worked in has a server room," Maggie said, "and every server room has a compliance officer, and every compliance officer has opinions. You pick things up." She went back into the conference room. It was not clean at 3:14 a.m., and there were 2 points in the last hour where Maggie genuinely thought it was going to collapse. Once when Farias raised a concern about indemnification language that his own legal team had drafted badly, and once when Miss Tseng asked a question that Maggie initially translated incorrectly, caught her own error, corrected it mid-sentence, and watched Harlow's lawyer nearly have a cardiac event. But they closed. Miss Tseng signed first, with the kind of deliberate elegance that made the act of picking up a pen look like a statement. Farias signed second, and when he put the pen down he looked at Maggie and said, in Portuguese, "You should have been a lawyer." "I like air conditioning," she said. He laughed again, the same short, surprised laugh. Then they were standing, and there were handshakes, and Price was ushering the Meridian delegation toward the elevators, and Maggie was quietly gathering the notepad she'd borrowed to make annotations during the meeting, and thinking about whether she needed to run one more diagnostic cycle on the server room before she left. "Mrs. Okafor." She turned. Harlow was standing 6 feet away. His jacket was off. He'd shed it somewhere around 2 a.m., and his sleeves were still rolled, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It wasn't the recalibration look from the beginning of the night. It was something that had moved past recalibration, past adjustment, into some territory she didn't have a word for. "The server room temperature is holding at 68, she said. "You'll want to schedule a maintenance check in the next 2 weeks. The backup system needs a full inspection. I can give you a written report." "I want to talk about what happened in that room," he said. I facilitated a translation. You can add it to the invoice. I usually charge a flat rate for Maggie. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her name, and he'd used the right one. Not Margaret, which Price had written down at the beginning of the night, but Maggie, which she'd told him was what she went by. She looked at him. "How many languages?" he asked. 5, she said. 6, if you count Igbo, but I'm conversational at best. My grandmother would tell you I'm an embarrassment. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The way a smile would look if it had been out of practice for a long time and was remembering how. "You walked in," he said, "to a negotiation that was falling apart, and you fixed it. The way you walked in and fixed the cooling system." "I fixed the cooling system first," she said. "The negotiation was, I was passing by." "You were passing by," he repeated. "The elevator is that direction." He looked at her for a long moment. The building was very quiet at 3:20 in the morning, the kind of quiet that cities only managed for a few hours before they started again. And in that quiet she was aware of the distance between them, 6 feet, which was not very far, and of the fact that she was still in her coveralls, which had a small grease mark on the left knee from where she'd braced herself against the floor in the mechanical room, and that none of this seemed to be the point. "I'm going to offer you a job," he said. "I have a job," she said. "Mr. Harlow, Vincent." She looked at him carefully. "Vincent," she said, testing it. "I fix air conditioning. I fix chillers and cooling towers and heat exchangers. I have 3 employees and 14 service contracts, and a van that has 140,000 miles on it, and a Frostex HVAC patch that I have worn on my 23 years old. That's who I am. I know who you are," he said. "You met me 4 hours ago. You told me to stop talking to you because it slowed you down," he said. "And I did. Do you know how many people have ever told me to stop talking?" He paused. "1, my mother, and she was usually right." Maggie looked at him for a moment. She was tired. She was also, she noticed, not tired in the way she usually was after a late call, the heavy, depleted tired of a job that had taken too much. She was tired the way you were when you'd done something that required everything you had and hadn't wasted a single piece of it. "I need to run one more check on the server room," she said. "I'll walk with you," he said. She considered this. "I'll stay out of your way," he agreed. They walked through the quiet building, side by side, and she pulled up the diagnostic screen, and the numbers were exactly where they needed to be. Temperature holding, pressure holding, system restored and stable in the dark, doing its invisible work. "It's good," she said. "Yes," he said. He wasn't looking at the screen. "It is." She sent the invoice 2 days later. It was itemized emergency call rate, parts at cost plus 30%, labor hours, and at the bottom, in a separate line, interpretation services. Flat rate, negotiated commercial acquisition $1,200. She'd gone back and forth on the number. It was probably low. She'd added a note. "Rate reflects the fact that I was already on site and technically in the middle of another job. Future engagements, should they occur, would be priced accordingly." Price called her the same afternoon. "Mr. Harlow has approved the invoice," he said. "He'd also like to discuss a retainer arrangement for HVAC." A pause. "Among other things," Price said. Maggie sat in her van in the parking lot of a medical office building in Astoria, where she had a noon service call, and she looked at the steering wheel for a moment, and then she called her aunt. Her aunt picked up on the second ring and immediately said, "You sound like something happened." "Something happened," Maggie said. "Good something or bad something?" Maggie thought about the server room at 1 a.m., and the conference table and Farius's surprised laugh, and the number 68 Fahrenheit on a diagnostic screen, while someone stood next to her and understood for the first time that the most important work in a building is the work you can't see from the lobby. "I don't know yet," she said. "Maybe both." Her aunt made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and was exactly what Maggie had needed to hear. "Then you'd better pay attention," her aunt said, "and figure it out." Maggie started the van. She had a service call to get to. She had 3 employees to pay and 14 contracts to keep. and a van with 140,000 miles that was going to need new brakes before winter. She had a patch on her sleeve that she'd earned, and languages in her head that her life had put there one by one, and a very specific skill set that the world had, for 31 years, almost entirely failed to notice. She pulled out of the parking lot and into the Astoria morning, and she thought, pay attention. She intended to.